Good morning. Welcome to today's story, a touching, humane, and educational tale.
Thrown out into the heat. By the time the power failed across Red Mesa and old men started collapsing on their porches, the whole town was breathing through one abandoned stone ice house at the edge of the highway. And the quiet 17-year-old boy everyone had dismissed as a burden was the one holding that place together with wet canvas, scrap lumber, and the kind of hard-earned knowledge you only get from losing almost everything too young. This story will show your audience how practical knowledge, quiet resilience, and the courage to trust what others overlook can turn a cast-off life into a lifeline, especially when a community is forced to learn the value of what it once ignored. The summer Eli Mercer lost his home, the heat had already turned mean, not just hot, not just uncomfortable, mean. It pressed down on Red Mesa, Texas, like a hand that would not lift. Sidewalks shimmered. Truck hoods burned skin. The air over the two-lane road looked silver and warped, as if the whole town were slowly melting under a hard white sun. Even the wind felt wrong, and dry, bitter, like someone opening the door to an oven. Eli stood in that heat with one duffel bag, a dented metal toolbox, and a folding cart that wobbled every time it hit a crack in the pavement. His Aunt Lenore did not come back to the door. She had already said everything she meant to say. "I did my part after your daddy died. I can't keep feeding a near-grown boy with no job and no plan." That was how she put it. Clean, cold, like she was talking about a bill she could not afford, not a child her husband's brother had left behind. Eli had not begged. He had learned a long time ago that begging never softened people who had already made up their minds. So he took what he could carry: 2 shirts, a flashlight, a coil of wire, a cracked water jug, and the old notebook his father had kept in the glove box of the service truck, full of penciled sketches about vents, fans, duct lines, shade, airflow, and heat. His father had been the kind of man who could walk into a sweltering room, stand still for 10 seconds, and tell you why it stayed hot. He'd always tells the truth. He used to say, "You just have to learn how to listen." Eli had listened. That was the trouble. He listened more than he talked. He noticed things other people missed. The rattle in an old window unit, the direction dust moved through a broken screen, the way cooler air pooled low in cinder-block garages long after sunset. Adults called him quiet when they meant strange. They called him difficult when they meant he saw too much. By noon, the back of his shirt was soaked. By 1, the water in his jug felt warm enough to make tea. By 2, he knew he could not drag that cart much farther without risking heat sickness himself. That was when he remembered the place his father had mentioned once or twice over the years: the old ice house. Not in town, exactly. Out past the feed store, beyond the empty citrus stand and the billboard with half the paint peeled off. A squat stone building near a dry service road, left over from another era, back when Red Mesa had needed thick walls and hauled ice more than compressors and central air. Most folks treated it like a dead thing. Kids dared each other to run up and touch the wall. Teenagers threw bottles at it. Grown people called it unsafe, useless, haunted by rattlesnakes, mold, or memories. Depending on who was talking, nobody went there unless they had lost a dog or their mind. Eli kept walking. By the time he reached it, the sun was dropping just enough to throw a thin slice of shadow along the west wall. The building looked rougher up close. Limestone blocks, rusted hinges, one side of the roof sagging, weeds as brittle as straw, a door hanging slightly crooked, like it had been opened too many times and loved by nobody. Still, there was something solid about it, something stubborn. Eli set down the cart, wiped the sweat from his eyes, and pushed the door. It groaned inward. The air that met him was stale, earthy, dim, and cooler. Not cold, but cooler. Enough cooler that his shoulders dropped before he even meant them to. He stood still for a moment, letting his breathing slow. The inside smelled like dust, damp stone, and old wood. Light came through a crack in the roof and one narrow vent high along the wall. The floor was uneven, the corners cluttered with debris, and the place was one good storm away from needing real repair. But the heat did not own this space. Not completely. Eli looked up at the thick walls, at the deep-set openings, at the shade, at the way the air seemed to settle low and hold. His father had been right about buildings like this. Stone remembered. Shade mattered. Airflow mattered. Old places were not always broken. Sometimes they were just forgotten by people too impatient to understand them. Outside, Red Mesa still buzzed and baked beneath the brutal Texas sky. Inside, for the first time all day, Eli did not feel like he was being pushed toward the edge of something. He slid his toolbox off the cart, set his duffel down against the wall, and listened. Somewhere above him, through the cracked vent in the failing roofline, the building gave a long, low creak, like a chest taking its first breath in years. Eli lifted his eyes and whispered, almost to himself, "You're not dead?" And without fully knowing why, he felt it answer back. The building begins to breathe. Eli slept lightly that first night, one hand resting on the handle of his father's old toolbox, his back against a limestone wall still cool from the deep shade it had held all day. By dawn, the inside of the ice house had changed, not because the place was suddenly fixed. It was still broken, still rough, still full of dust, warped boards, mouse droppings, and the sour smell of years left alone. But in the pale morning light, it no longer felt abandoned. It felt observant. Eli stepped outside just after sunrise. The desert sky over Red Mesa was clear and colorless in that hard Texas way, already promising another punishing day. He poured a splash of warm water over his face, pushed his damp hair back, and looked at the building with the practical, steady gaze his father had taught him to use. Don't start with what's wrong. Start with what still works. The walls were thick. That mattered. The windows were narrow and deep set. That mattered too. The roof had damage, but not a total collapse. One side still held enough shade to protect the interior through the hottest hours. There were two old vent openings high along the back wall, half clogged with nests and grit, and one lower intake opening near the east side that had been boarded over years ago. Eli crouched there for a long moment, studying the structure. Heat rises, he murmured. Cool air settles. Give it a path. He could hear his father saying it. That whole morning, Eli worked with a quiet, stubborn focus. He hauled out broken crates, swept dirt into piles with a dead mesquite branch, and pried off warped planks to uncover the lower opening. Dust clung to his shirt. Sweat ran down his spine. More than once, the heat outside made his knees feel soft. Still, every time he stepped back inside, the difference hit him. Not dramatic, not magical, just real. By noon, he'd rigged the first small change. He took an old strip of canvas he found in the debris, cleaned it as best he could, soaked it with water from his jug, and hung it where the air moved through the newly opened intake. Then he cracked the back vent wider with a rusted bar. The breeze that came through was faint, but it moved. Eli stood there, feeling it pass over his arm. Cooler, dampened, not enough for comfort yet, but enough to prove the building could still do what it had once been built to do. That was when he heard a voice from the doorway. Well, I'll be damned. Eli turned sharply. An old man stood there in a sweat-faded feed cap, suspenders, and dusty work boots, one hand wrapped around a cane smooth from years of use. His face was leathery, lined, and severe, but his eyes were sharp as all points. I leave this place alone 20 years, the man said. And first thing I know, some scarecrow boy is in here trying to teach it manners. Eli straightened. I'm not hurting anything. The old man snorted. Didn't say you were, said you looked like a scarecrow. He stepped inside slowly, glancing around with the strange expression people get when a memory catches them off guard. His gaze moved over the wall vents, the damp canvas, the cleared floor. Then he looked back at Eli. Who taught you to open the low side first? My dad. The old man nodded once, almost reluctantly. Then your dad had sense. His name was Jasper Wynn. Eli had heard it before. Everybody in Red Mesa had. Jasper was one of those men folks joked about in public and listened to in private, though fewer and fewer bothered listening now. Years ago, he'd worked maintenance all over the county. Before that, as he told it, he'd helped haul block ice into this very building when he was barely older than Eli. This wasn't made to fight winter, Jasper said, tapping the wall with his knuckles. It was made to survive summer before folks got lazy and started trusting every comfort to a machine. Eli glanced around the room. It still can. Jasper looked at him for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he said, maybe. That single word landed heavier than praise. Later that afternoon, when the sun turned vicious and the highway shimmered like water, another visitor came. A pickup rolled up in a cloud of pale dust. A woman stepped out wearing navy scrubs, sunglasses, and the tired expression of somebody who had spent too many hours dealing with other people's emergencies. Maribel, the nurse from the clinic. She paused at the doorway, hand on her hip, taking in Eli, the half-cleared room. The old man by the wall, the wet canvas hanging in the intake. I heard there was a kid living out here, she said. I expected worse. That makes two of us, Jasper muttered. Mara ignored him and stepped inside. Then she stopped. Not because the place looked good, it didn't, but because she felt it. The air. She pulled off her sunglasses slowly. Why is it cooler in here than my exam room? Eli glanced toward the vent, trying not to sound too hopeful. Because this place still knows what it was built for. Mara studied him then, really studied him, as if she wasn't sure whether she was looking at a homeless teenager or the beginning of an answer nobody in Red Mesa had thought to ask for yet. Outside, the sun kept climbing. Inside, the old stone building held its breath and began, little by little, to breathe again. The town laughs. Then the heat turns cruel. By the next afternoon, the ice house no longer felt like a place Eli was merely hiding in. It felt like a problem he was trying to solve. The damp canvas at the lower intake was helping. The open vent near the back wall was helping. The shade from the west side still held through late afternoon, and the thick limestone kept the worst of the sun from swallowing the room whole. It was not comfortable yet, but it was survivable. And in a town like Red Mesa, in a summer like this one, survivable was starting to mean more than pride. Eli spent the morning working with Toby, who had shown up early with a grin, a pocket knife, and the kind of eager loyalty boys that age gave without warning. I brought nails, Toby said, holding up a bent coffee can full of rusted ones. Some are straight. Then we're rich, Eli said. Toby laughed. And for the first time in days, Eli heard himself laugh too. They rigged old burlap sacks over part of the doorway to cut glare without killing airflow. They dragged in 2 more buckets for water. Jasper, muttering the whole time, showed Eli where an older drainage channel ran beneath one wall and explained how the original builders had used earth, stone, shade, and moving air together instead of fighting heat head-on. People today want a button, Jasper said. They don't trust anything they can't plug in. By noon, Maribel came by in her pickup again, this time with bottled water, electrolyte packets, and the sharp, weary look of somebody who had seen too much in one shift. The clinic's filling up, she said quietly. Mostly dehydration. 2 heat exhaustion cases before 10 this morning. One old rancher passed out at the gas pump. Eli set down the hammer in his hand. It's getting worse. Mara gave him a long look. Yes, it is. He hesitated, then spoke before he could talk himself out of it. If the power goes down, or if people's units start failing, this place could help. Maybe not everybody, but kids, seniors, folks who just need to get their core temp down. Toby nodded hard, like it was already obvious. Jasper folded his arms and said nothing. Mara glanced around the room again. She could feel what Eli meant. Anyone with sense could. The air inside the ice house was not miraculous, but it was lower, calmer, less vicious than the heat outside clawing at the parking lot. You'd need cots, water, better airflow, maybe tarps outside for extra shade, she said, thinking out loud. I know, Eli said, but it could work. Mara looked at him with something like reluctant hope. Then you'd better tell someone with a badge before this town decides you're running a death trap. That was how Eli ended up at the edge of the sheriff's office lot an hour later. Dusty, sweaty, and already regretting every step that had brought him there. Sheriff Dana Holt stood on the shaded porch in a tan uniform, one hand resting on her belt, her expression unreadable in the white afternoon glare. He explained it all anyway. The building, the stone walls, the temperature difference, the vents, the way it could become a cooling shelter if the grid got hit hard. Dana listened. Then she said, so let me get this straight. A 17-year-old boy sleeping in an unsafe abandoned structure wants the town to start sending people there during a heat emergency. Eli felt his neck burn. And it was not from the sun. It's not unsafe if it's stabilized. It's not legal if it's not inspected. A man sitting outside the hardware store overheard enough to smirk, then another did. By the time Eli crossed Main Street again, he could feel it happening. The quick sideways glances, the little laughs, the easy dismissal of people who had decided what he was before he ever opened his mouth. That night, he sat alone inside the ice house after Toby left. The room was dim. The stone smelled cool and mineral in the dark. Crickets sang outside in the weeds. For a little while, Eli let the hurt settle in. Not the sheriff's words. Not really. It was older than that. It was every room where adults had looked past him. Every moment when being quiet made people think he had nothing worth saying. Every time surviving had made him look small instead of strong. Then, just before sunset, he heard tires on gravel. Mara stepped out of her truck, her face tight with urgency. Eli. Something in her voice made him rise before she said another word. The elementary school lost air for almost an hour today, she said. 3 kids got sick at summer program. His stomach dropped. Was Lila there? Mara nodded once. She's okay, but barely. For one long second, Eli could not breathe. He saw his little sister's face in his mind. Flushed. Frightened, stubbornly trying not to cry. Outside, the heat still radiated off the ground long after sunset, as if the whole town had stored up the day's suffering and refused to let it go. Mara stepped closer. I think you're right, she said softly. I think this town's about to need that building. And for the first time, Eli understood something colder than fear. There was no more time left to convince people gently. The heat was coming faster now, and soon, Red Mesa would learn what happened when comfort failed, and only the forgotten things still knew how to endure. The night the town came running, the blackout hit Red Mesa at 4:17 in the afternoon. 1 minute the town was limping along on weak air conditioners and overworked fans. The next, everything clicked off at once. The grocery store went dim. The gas station signs died. Window units fell silent all over town. And the heat, already brutal, turned immediate. Not louder, not sharper, just closer. It pressed into homes with sealed windows and thin walls. It gathered in classrooms, trailers, kitchens, and back bedrooms where old people sat in recliners, and children tried to nap with damp washcloths on their foreheads. Without the hum of machinery, Red Mesa sounded wrong. Too still, too bare. Like the town had lost the one thing standing between it and the sun. Eli was outside the ice house when the power failed. He had been tying up a tarp along the west side with Toby, trying to add one more layer of shade before evening. The moment the lights across town went out, they both stopped and looked toward Main Street. Toby swallowed. That's bad, isn't it? Eli didn't answer right away. He did not need to. Mara's pickup came flying down the gravel road less than 10 minutes later, dust rising behind her like smoke. She jumped out before the truck had fully stopped. It's everywhere, she said, breathless. Clinic backup's gone. Half the older homes are already turning into ovens. We don't have room. We don't have time. Eli looked at the ice house door, then back at her. Mara held his gaze. We open it now. That was all it took. The next hour moved with the hard, urgent rhythm of people who knew panic would waste precious energy. Toby hauled buckets. Jasper, sweating through his work shirt, barked instructions and dragged out old planks to brace the inner passage. Mara set up a folding table for water and cooling cloths. Eli moved through the building like he had been waiting for this moment since the day he first stepped inside. Open the low intake wider. Keep the upper vent clear. Hang wet canvas. Darken the west opening. Move people toward the back, where the stone held longest. Everything his father had ever taught him came back clean and fast. Don't crowd the airflow, he told Toby. Keep the water in the shade, he told Mara. Not too much at once, he told the first frightened family that hurried in. Let the place stay balanced. At first, only a handful of people came. A grandmother with trembling hands, a young mother carrying a limp little boy, 2 men from the feed store, both red-faced and dizzy. Then more. Word traveled fast in a small town, especially when fear gave it legs. By sundown, the old ice house was full of low voices, restless children, and the soft sound of people drinking water too quickly because they had waited too long. The inside was still warm, but it was bearable, safer, human. Every time the door opened, the outside air rolled in like fire. And every time Eli felt the building fight to hold its ground. Then Sheriff Dana Holt arrived. She stepped in wearing her uniform shirt darkened with sweat, one arm supporting Mrs. Calder, a widow in her 80s whose breathing came shallow and fast. For one brief second, Dana looked at Eli, and all the old skepticism was gone. Tell me where to put her, she said. There was no pride in that moment, no victory, just work. Back wall, Eli answered. Lowest heat, keep her sipping, not gulping. Dana nodded and did exactly what he said. The hardest moment came after dark. A dry gust hit from the south, hot and sudden, and one weakened section of the side overhang gave a sharp, cracking groan. People flinched. A child started crying. Dust drifted from the beam line near the entrance. Jasper looked up. She's shifting. Mara turned to Eli. We need to move them. He stared at the beam, thinking fast. If they emptied the place now, Some of the weakest ones would go straight back into heat that could finish what the day had started. If they stayed and the overhang failed, panic could tear through the room in seconds. Then he saw it. Not the danger, the answer. Not everybody, he said. Just the front section. Toby, clear the first 10 feet. Jasper, with me. They moved fast. Eli and Jasper hauled 2 support posts from the side pile, wedged them under the sagging frame, and hammered them into place with short, brutal strikes that echoed through the building. Sweat burned Eli's eyes. His palms tore. For 1 second, the beam dipped lower. Then it held. A shaky silence passed through the room. And right then, Mara came through the door with one more child in her arms. Lila. Eli's whole body went still. His little sister's face was flushed deep red. Her hair clung damply to her forehead. Even half-conscious, she looked small enough to break his heart all over again. We found her at Lenora's place, Mara said softly. The house was too hot. Eli crossed the room in 2 strides and dropped to his knees beside her. For a moment, the noise around him disappeared. The town, the building, the heat, all of it. There was only Lila. He pressed a cooling cloth to her neck with shaking hands. "You're okay," he whispered, though his own throat had tightened. "You hear me? Bug, you're okay now." Around them, the ice house stayed standing. The people stayed breathing. And through the long, punishing night, the place everyone had called useless became the one place in Red Mesa that still knew how to protect human life. What the town rebuilt was more than a building. By sunrise, the worst of the heat had not passed, but the fear had changed shape. Inside the old ice house, people were still lying on blankets, sipping water, speaking in hushed voices, and watching the light creep slowly across the limestone floor. Children who had cried themselves to sleep now stirred beside exhausted mothers. Old men who had come in glassy-eyed and weak were breathing easier. The air was still heavy, still warm, but it was no longer merciless. And Eli, who had been on his feet nearly all night, sat beside Lila with his back against the wall, one arm resting near her blanket, as if some part of him still believed she might disappear if he looked away too long. When she finally opened her eyes, her voice came out dry and small. "Eli." He leaned closer at once. "I'm here." Her fingers found his wrist. "I knew you'd come." That nearly broke him, not because she said it dramatically, not because she cried, but because she said it like it had always been true, even when the rest of the world had treated him like someone easy to throw away. By mid-morning, the town had started to understand what had happened. Red Mesa had not been saved by luck. It had not been saved by a miracle. It had been saved by a forgotten building. And a quiet boy people had judged too fast. Sheriff Dana Holt stood near the doorway, watching volunteers carry in more water and folding cots from the church hall. At some point, she crossed the room and stopped in front of Eli. There was no badge in her voice now, no distance. "I was wrong," she said plainly, "about the place. About you." Eli looked up at her. Tired enough not to hide behind caution, Dana glanced around the room. At the braced beam, the soaked canvas, the shaded entrance, the families who were still here because they had nowhere safer to go. "You saw what the rest of us didn't," she said, "and you acted before we were ready to listen." It was not a grand speech. It did not need to be. In a town like Red Mesa, the plain truth carried farther than polished words ever could. Later that day, Mara worked with the church deacons, the school principal, and half a dozen neighbors to turn the ice house into something official. Not fancy, not perfect, but real, a community cooling shelter, a place with water, first aid supplies, cots, fresh tarps, and a sign-up board for volunteers. Old Jasper, stubborn as ever, grumbled the whole time, while secretly directing every repair like a man 20 years younger. Then, just before noon, he walked over to Eli and held out a ring of old iron keys. "They don't open much anymore," Jasper said, "but they belonged here. And right now, so do you." Eli stared at the keys for a second before taking them. It felt heavier than metal ought to feel. Not because of what it was, because of what it meant. For the first time since his father died, for the first time since Lenora had shut that door behind him, Eli did not feel like a boy standing outside someone else's life. He felt rooted. Weeks later, when the worst of summer still had not fully let go, the old ice house stood cleaner, steadier, and busier than it had in decades. Kids came by after school with water jugs. Retired men helped patch the roof. Mara organized heat safety classes there. Dana pushed the paperwork through so Eli could stay legally, return to school, and start apprenticing with county maintenance crews. And Lila, she liked to sit in the doorway in the evenings and tell anyone who would listen, "My brother saved this place before everybody else knew they needed it." But the truth was softer than that. Eli did help save the town. That part was real. Still, what he rescued first was something smaller, quieter, and maybe even more important. He rescued the idea that being overlooked does not mean being worthless. He rescued the kind of old knowledge people laugh at, right up until it keeps them alive. And he rescued a piece of himself that grief, rejection, and heat had nearly worn down to nothing. So let me ask you something. What is the forgotten ice house in your own life? What have you been taught to dismiss because it looks too old, too broken, too small, or too far gone? And who have you underestimated just because they were quiet? Sometimes the thing the world throws aside is the very thing that holds when everything else fails. If this story touched you, and if you believe strength does not always look loud, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories here about forgotten people, hidden value, and the kind of courage that changes everything, often when no one sees it coming.